just exactly how did this guy scam almost $40 million from smart businessmen? Find out how he lured them right in. Everything for Cassell Kuoh came to an end one early morning in November 2016. He had just flown in from Liberia to see his family in Charlotte, North Carolina. He was just getting his kids ready for school, just like any other morning. But there was a knock on the door. An agent from Homeland Security Investigations wanted to ask Kuoh some questions. Kuoh was initially unfriendly in his answers, but then the agent declared, "We have a warrant to arrest you." For anyone, seeing $100 million worth of gold right in front of you would be a once-in-a-lifetime experience. This is what one businessman from Atlanta who wanted to stay anonymous experienced. The gold was indeed real, but he unfortunately was going to be a part of one of the most convincing and sophisticated scams that has ever been witnessed by the U.S. law enforcement. This scam was made possible by a lot of ingenuity and corrupt government officials in Africa. The unfortunate anonymous businessman described the whole ordeal. He described the setup for the whole scam scheme that was so convincing that anyone, even the smartest person, would easily fall for this scam. I mean, this is what all people who got scammed would say, right? Because if they got scammed, there would be no way that someone else wouldn't fall for it. The Atlanta businessman fell for this scam back in 2015. He had received a call from one of his friends who told him about a miner named Cassell Kuoh from Liberia. Obviously, his friend had nothing but good things to say about Cassell. Kuoh was described as a success story in Liberia. He was a philanthropist for the impoverished communities in Africa. And this is actually true. He was a founder of a soccer team. This was true too. The businessman was also told that Kuoh owned warehouses filled with diamonds and gold that were worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He was described as an up-and-coming Liberian businessman who could be trusted for big transactions, and his friend was seeing if he wanted to invest. According to public records and statements made in open court from June 2012 to December 2016, Kuoh orchestrated a fraudulent scheme involving the purchase, shipment, and export of unrefined gold and rough diamonds allegedly located in Liberia. Kuoh was a Liberian national who owned Phoenix Mining, an investment group which was supposedly to be in the precious metal and gemstone business. Chris Healy is an assistant special agent in charge of Homeland Security Investigations in Charlotte. He was shocked at just how much money was involved. It wasn't just $1 million or $2 million, or even $5 million. The amount was around $30 to $40 million. Obviously, the guy was already falling for this, but he wanted to make sure that Kuoh was the real deal. He did some background research on Kuoh and met him in New York City. He wanted to test some of his gold to make sure that it was real. And yep, the gold test passed with flying colors. But he even took it a step further. He wanted to go to Liberia to see the gold mines for himself, so Kuoh said, okay. While he was in Liberia, he visited the mining sites. He visited with the government officials of Liberia. He was also invited to Kuoh's home and met his family. He went to Kuoh's office where Kuoh showed him around 900 pounds of gold. There were sacks filled with gold and also nearly 24 gold bars next to the sacks. All this was real gold. Okay, maybe this guy was right. Maybe it is hard not to fall for this, because seeing was believing. The problem for this guy was that it was all smoke and mirrors. Kuoh had done the same kit and caboodle for many people over the years. Sometimes he would even bring gold in bulletproof vans guarded by our men. Why did this work? Because psychologically, no one would spend this much money and put in this much work just to run a scam, right? And who actually had access to hundreds of millions of dollars of gold, even if it's just to put on a show. People are made to travel thousands of miles to see the gold, and they were allowed to do even more testing on the gold in any way they like. But while these clients were mesmerized by the sheer amount of gold that's shown to them, they forgot to ask one crucial question. Who actually owned the gold? The trick was simple. Show that there was gold, real gold, and lots of it. Once the clients were convinced, then the rest was on them. They just needed to help get the gold to the US. What the potential clients needed to do was pay for any costs that were required for the certifications and shipment of the gold. Then they would sell the gold and split the profit. Yep, this is how the money poured in. The Atlanta businessman wasn't the only person scammed. People from all over the world, including the UAE, South Africa, India, and Saudi Arabia, jumped in falling for this scam. Do you see where this is going yet? How did Kuoh get his hands on so much gold? He did have access to the gold, but that gold was not ever going to be moving anywhere. That's because the vast majority of the gold belonged to the government. All Kuoh did was bribe Liberian government officials, and he could show the gold all day long. Of course, with any scammer, there's some semblance of the truth. He does have his own mine, but it didn't produce anywhere close to the amount of gold he said he had. Whenever clients wanted to see the gold, he would just bring in the amount of gold the client wanted to see. That amount of gold would be brought straight in from the government. Sometimes Kuoh would even make deals with government officials of other African countries and gold refinery operators in order to make these meetings happen. And these other government officials would happily comply. Why would they care if some poor sucker was getting scammed? Okay, so what would happen once Kuoh got the money? Well, after this, the game was delay, and then do some more delays. Kuoh had set up a fake website where the clients could track their shipments, but like clockwork, the website was always updated with new unforeseen delays. New stories of why the gold was getting delayed would pop up. These clients were so thirsty for gold profits, Kuoh would even be able to convince clients to pay a little more to get the shipment to come. He would just tell the clients that the shipment would be canceled unless they paid more. Most of the time, he would say that the shipment was stuck at customs and it would take time. But the actual truth was, there was no package. Kuoh would just completely make up documents and keep on telling stories to keep the clients hooked to the process. It was a vicious cycle. In reality, Kuoh used investors' money to fund his personal lifestyle. The delays became a fact of life for the Atlanta businessman. In his mind, things getting delayed in customs was normal. He had no reason not to believe any of the delays, because he spoke with Kuoh nearly every day on the phone. The money he had invested wasn't only his own, but he also invested money from his close friends and relatives. All that only made Kuoh richer day by day. He was traveling around the world and living a life of luxury. He bought a house in Charlotte, North Carolina for his wife and kids. He was enjoying a life of luxury in the U.S. Kuoh thought for a long time that he wouldn't be caught. He was convinced that the Liberian government officials he bribed would be able to help him, as they were also involved in this conspiracy. All the earlier stories we had told you about Kuoh actually were true. He had built up a Robin Hood-like image in his country. He was beloved by the impoverished Liberians for the things that he did for his community, something the Atlanta businessman witnessed himself. He donated a lot of money regularly to his church. He would feed a lot of people in the city. Kuoh helped to send several children in his community to school. He installed 24 hand pumps in his village for safe drinking water. And this was one of the first things that attracted the Atlanta businessman to Kuoh when he made that first trip to Liberia. Kuoh himself said that despite everything, he wanted to take care of his people. All in all, he spent a whopping $8 million on his community back in Liberia. Let's go back to that morning in November 2016. On that day, Kuoh was arrested by Homeland Security. The Atlanta businessman was completely shocked. He had no idea why anyone would arrest someone like Cassel, even after he was arrested. And he wasn't the only one. Obviously, all of Kuoh's clients were convinced by the show that he had put up. They couldn't believe that he was capable of running such a scam. Not after giving so much away to his community. One client would not believe it at all, and Kuoh had to call him on the phone himself to tell him to stop sending money to his associates because it was a giant scam. Cassel pleaded guilty to wire fraud conspiracy. He cooperated with authorities and hoped for a reduced sentence by telling his story. Surprisingly, he didn't refute any of his wrongdoings. Surprisingly, Kuoh actually said that getting arrested was the best thing that had happened to him. He was happy that he got caught because he was going down the wrong path. Interestingly enough, he did give a reason to why he did it. Apparently, it was him being part of a scammer syndicate that led him to commit the crime. According to Kuoh, he owed the syndicate a lot. Kuoh claimed to be filled with regret and confessed that he thought a lot about his victims, especially the Atlanta businessman, and he's happy that no one would be victimized by him anymore. Do you think he's still putting on a show here? The Liberian embassy was contacted after Kuoh's story to the authorities. They applauded the arrest of Kuoh and expressed deep concerns about corrupt officials who may be trying to exploit the gold and diamond industry. But, surprise, surprise, they denied any knowledge of any government officials being involved in the scam. So, did confessing to everything and showing remorse help? Nope. That was probably the real reason he was crying. Kuoh was sentenced to 17 years in prison and ordered to pay $16.2 million in restitution. Yeah, good luck getting that $16.2 million. Watch this next video to learn about how one of the biggest banks in the world helped Mexican cartels launder money.